Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you can join us today. Before I introduce my colleague, Dr. Clint Carroll, who will be in dialogue with Dr. Wall Kimmerer, we would like to acknowledge that the University of Colorado Boulder sits on the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Eastern Shoshone peoples, and that 48 tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. It's critical not only to acknowledge, but also to actively address the particular harms that settler colonialism and institutions who benefit from colonialism, including CU Boulder, perpetuate on Indigenous lands and peoples, especially in the context of this event, which is part of a Mellon Sawyer seminar where we are seeking to attend to more capacious humanities, arts, and sciences-based alliances for long-term ecological transformation. Simultaneously, we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the sociocultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. We'd like to thank our collaborative partners today. This program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners at CU Boulder, the Nest Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazards Center, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Art and Art History Department, and the CU Natural History Museum. This public lecture is one of multiple, along with several art exhibitions around the Boulder-Denver area, and these will continue in the spring as part of the 2020-2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. We aim to traverse multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions concerning the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in varying and inequitable ways. This project calls for empathy, attunement, and an outlook that encompasses a diversity of individuals, communities, and collaborative entities committed to climate justice and more ethically durable futures. So please visit our Environmental Futures website. You can learn more, you can register for upcoming events. And then finally, if you have questions at the close of this conversation with Dr. Kimmerer and Dr. Carroll, please click on the Q&A button and we'll take these selected questions as best we can. So now I'm honored to introduce my colleague here at CU Boulder, Clint Carroll. He's an associate professor of ethnic studies with a doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in environmental science, policy, and management, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Arizona in anthropology. His book, Roots of Our Renewal, Ethnobotany and Cherokee Environmental Governance, was published in 2015 by the University of Minnesota Press. It explores how tribal natural resource managers navigate the material and structural conditions of settler colonialism. He's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and Dr. Carroll works closely with the Cherokee people in Oklahoma with funding from the National Science Foundation on issues of land conservation and the perpetuation of land-based knowledge and ways of life. Thank you so much to Dr. Carroll and to Dr. Kimmerer for joining us today. I'll turn it to you, Clint.
Osio Negadawo. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Erin. It is my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Wall Kimmerer. Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, a decorated professor, and an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Dr. Kimmerer is a distinguished teaching professor of environmental biology at the State University of New York. She is also the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs that draw on the wisdom of both Indigenous and scientific knowledge for the shared goals of sustainability. She holds a BS in botany from SUNY ESF, an MS and PhD in botany from the University of Wisconsin. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, has earned wide acclaim and was recently reprinted by Milkweed Press in a hardcover special edition. Her first book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Her other work has appeared in Orion, Whole Terrain, and she is the author of numerous scientific papers on plant ecology, bryophyte ecology, traditional knowledge, and restoration ecology. As a writer and a scientist, her interests in restoration include not only the restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationships to land. She lives on an old farm in upstate New York, tending gardens, both cultivated and wild. And on a personal note, Robin has been an inspiration to me ever since I started grad school about 16 years ago and read her article in Bioscience titled Weaving Traditional Ecological Knowledge into Biological Education, a Call to Action, that was published in 2002. In a time when dominant disciplines in the academy were still highly skeptical of Indigenous knowledges, Robin offered a critical voice and a path forward, which she continues to model in her writing and work. I brought my 3-year-old daughter to see her speak in Minneapolis when Braiding Sweetgrass was first released in 2013. I've been teaching the book in my classes ever since, and my daughter, who is now 10 years old, is very familiar with many of the teachings and concepts in the book, whether that be from bedtime stories or just walking around and talking with each other. Needless to say, I'm a big fan of Robin, and so please help me extend a warm welcome to Robin for being with us today.
Miigwech, Clint. Miigwech, thank you for that warm welcome. And I remember meeting your daughter, and I was so thrilled to meet you the first time in person because, you know, this notion of being in community around these ideas that we hold so important. I really value your leadership in our field and your friendship as well. So, Miigwech. To everyone, I'd like to start with a traditional protocol greeting of Bonjour. Shabadaske gish kokwe nadejnakas, bodwe wad mi kwenda, megaze dodem minwa makoto dem. Shishibanyak nibendagwes, Syracuse, New York, Nadotch Pia. And in our beautiful Potawatomi language, of which I'm just a beginning student, I've told you that my name is Light Shining Through Sky Woman. I am Potawatomi Anishinaabe, member of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles. And I'm enrolled in Oklahoma in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation in Shawnee. I live today in the heart of Maple Nation in upstate New York, which is in the same biome as our traditional Potawatomi Anishinaabe original homelands, as you'll see in a map that I'll share with you in just a little bit. Because we are all spending so much time on Zoom screens and too little outdoors, I've put together some slides to invite our relatives to be with us and to share their way of being. So let's go out here. Be sure that I can get my screen shared. Let's go. There we are. Are you seeing my screen yet? No, doesn't look like you are. No?
We see it. I see it on my end, Robin.
Great, but it's supposed to be full screen. Do you?
If you go to the bottom right and click on that.
Oh, there we
A
go.
little bit further to the left, click on that slide right there.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Clint.
You good? Okay.
It's also our traditional practice to always begin with gratitude. We say that that is our first responsibility as people in return for the gifts we are given is to be grateful. So as we begin our time together, to remember that when we first put our feet on Mother Earth this morning on Shkok we had everything that we needed. We had that first breath of beautiful, cool morning air. We had a drink of water. We had food, our families, our friends. We had the companionship of clouds and geese flying in the sky. We had everything that we needed, and we give gratitude for all that has been given to us. I also want to give gratitude for the homelands of the Haudenosaunee who are my neighbors. And I live here, as I said, in what is today called upstate New York, which is the heart of Haudenosaunee territory. My neighbors just over my back hill are the Onondaga Nation, to whom we owe a debt, an unpaid debt of land, of history, and particularly relevant to our shared work, a debt of knowledge and philosophy and practice of how we might better care for the land, and give all gratitude to my neighbors. I also want to mention again how grateful I am to be here with you, and grateful that yesterday I got to be part of the class associated with Deep Horizons and the Sawyer Mellon seminars. And I was so impressed. We had such a rich conversation. And one of the things that really struck me was the import of this notion of thinking about environmental futures of both looking at the past, as the language was, illuminating the casualties, as well as illuminating the future into the prospects of the future that we will share. And that conversation yesterday really shapes what I wanted to share today. That and the prospect of getting to talk to Clint for a while. I really wanted to just structure this talk as little snippets, little ideas that might seed a conversation with Clint, because I so value that exchange that is about to happen. So again, this idea of making visible this spectrum of casualties and prospects is what I'd really like to talk about. And in yesterday's class, with artists, with scientists, with writers, musicians, all sorts of different students, I was really struck by the grasp of how much we need multiple ways of knowing. If we are to progress toward what a truly right relationships with land that will sustain us and will sustain the land. And in Anishinaabe ways of knowing, we are reminded that we were given at least 4 ways of knowing: mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And that I've been told on any number of occasions, often with a finger wag at this scientist, to say, you have to use all of these ways of knowing. Because, of course, as academics, most of us in this audience today, we really are trained to privilege the intellect, aren't we, as the primary way of knowing, and the body, that which we can sense and observe. But it's so important that when we think about our environmental futures, we also engage emotion and spirit. And I'll be doing that today in some storytelling, because stories, of course, are whole ways of understanding. Thanks, Clint, for mentioning the book, Braiding Sweetgrass, but I couldn't speak without invoking my great teacher, Sweetgrass. You see here the beautiful shining braids of what we call wingoshk, who we call wingoshk in our language. And this beautiful plant, who in Potawatomi ways of knowing, we regard as the hair of Mother Earth, you almost always see sweetgrass gifted as braids. And it comes from remembering what it is when we braid someone's hair, that it's an act of love. It's an act of relationship and of caring for the well-being of that being. And sweetgrass carries that weight. It is a sign of our commitment to caretaking for Shkakmikwe, for Mother Earth. And for me in the book, the 3 strands of knowledge, of Indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, which are both human knowledges, aren't they? They're us trying to make sense of the world. But I also want to honor in the 3rd strand, the knowledge of the plants themselves. And it is out of those 3 knowledges that I hope that we might better braid Mother Earth's hair, as it were, of caring for her. And the enterprise that brings this seminar together as well as the enterprise of my work in Syracuse that I'll tell you a little bit about, is absolutely tied up in this notion of using all three knowledges: Western knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and the knowledge of our more than human teachers, to decolonize our education, to open our minds so that we might unlearn some things and learn new things. And again, this notion of unlearning and learning will underpin what I have to share today. For me, there was not always an easy relationship between those three strands of knowledge. As a Native student entering into a hyper scientific institution all of those years ago, it was an experience of assimilation, of colonization, where I was told that how I understood the living world as a young Potawatomi botanist had no room in academia, that it wasn't science. In fact, I was told that maybe I should have gone to art school if I was so interested in the beauty of the world. And so I'm really proud to say that right down the hall from where I was told that I needed to leave Indigenous knowledge and those ways of thinking behind, we now have the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, which is designed to be a medicine for that kind of monocultural thinking and to encourage what has been variously called two-eyed seeing, right? To think about not looking at the world through just one lens of Western science and the Western worldview, but how much richer, how much more complete and effective might be our practices in the world if we saw with both eyes, if we saw with all of the gifts around the medicine wheel. And this is our work. Again, reflecting on the theme of this seminar of environmental futures, looking at the past and also into the future, made me know that what I needed to share with you today is a little piece of a very important teaching of Anishinaabe peoples that certainly frames my work and perhaps frames your work as well, our collective work of living well on the planet. It also seemed very timely that I might share this evening, because one of the great teachers of these lessons and writers around these teachings, Eddie Benton Benai, just passed a few days ago. And he was a major influence and carrier of this teaching. And so I want to share my small, limited understanding of it in his honor today. The people of the seventh fires refer to periods in our history of the Anishinaabe people. And during the time of the first fire, it's said that our Anishinaabe people lived with our Wabanaki relatives there at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, as you see in this map from Eddie Benton's book. And it's said that long time ago, a prophet came among the people when all of our people were together and said, big changes are coming to Turtle Island. And in order to safeguard the sacred fire, some people are going to have to move to the west, to carry that sacred fire to the west to protect it. And it was with heavy heart that people did that they left their relatives behind and headed on a westward migration that took at least 7 fires. And again, these fires are historic periods in our people's history. I don't have time this evening to tell you the whole story. I'll just give you the broadest brush strokes. But our people moved to the west, where the prophet said we would come to live among the food that grows on the water. And so for the first fires, we moved west and west and west. And it was about the time of the third fire that those big changes did come to Turtle Island, that the white sails were seen in the east of the Zaganash, the newcomers coming to Turtle Island. And as a result of that, the many changes, of course, happened, and those changes were prophesied by these great teachers, but they're also history. And I want to focus on this point because it is also the theme of your seminar, this environmental futures of the past and the future dancing together, being in dialogue with one another. And that's just what happens here, because in our way of thinking, time doesn't move in a line, time moves in spirals and circles. And so what was prophecy becomes history. What is history becomes prophecy. So the future and the past are all in conversation with one another. The prophets told the people and foretold exactly what happened, that there would come a time when the people were separated from their lands and driven out of their own homelands. There would come a time when the black robes came among our people, and if the and tried to break up the circle of the people, and if the people were taken by those teachings, great suffering would come among the people, as we know it has. There would come a time, said the prophets, that there's so much that's told that our language would be lost, and that when the children turned to the elders to learn their own languages, it wouldn't be there, that the children would be taken from their families. All of these things that we know have befallen Native peoples were prophesied and are part of this teaching. Eventually, of course, our people did end up in the Great Lakes, the place where the food grows on the water, Manoman, the wild rice, and that was our traditional homes. But the prophets told us that even in those places, there would soon come a time when you couldn't dip your cup into the water and take a cool drink. There would come a time when the air would get so thick and hot that you couldn't breathe it. And that there would come a time when the plants and animals began to turn their faces away from us. And here we are. History, prophecy, intermingling, as we here are on the cusp of climate chaos, climate catastrophe in the age of the sixth extinction. The prophets also said that in the time of the seventh fire, a new people would emerge, and these people needed to have tremendous courage and foresight and work together for the challenges that face them, because it said that all the world's people, not only the Anishinaabe, but the Zaganash, the newcomers as well, all the world's people would find themselves standing at a fork in the road with a big choice to make about the future of life in our home. And one of the teaching says that one of those paths would be soft and green, and you could walk barefoot there. And that's the path that would lead to right relationship with one another and with the land. And the other path would be black and burnt. It would be all sharp cinders, and to walk there, you would cut your feet. And we know that we do stand at this juncture in time. We have a choice to make. And the elders, the prophets of this very important teaching for all people said, we can't just go bounding down that green path. We know which path we want to take, but we can't move there yet. They said that what we have to do is to walk back along our ancestors' path and pick up what was left for us along the way. And what was left for us along the way, of course, this was not that they were just not dropped by mistake, right? The language was violently taken from us. Our ceremonies, our songs, our teachings, our seeds, our language was all taken from us. But now is the time when the seventh fire people will go back and pick it back up. Pick up those things. And once we have picked them up and put them in our bundles, all of us, all the world's people in all colors of the medicine wheel, can then go together and walk down that green, soft path, informed by the original teachings of the people of Turtle Island. And then, if we do that, together we could light the eighth fire. And that eighth fire is this time of ongoing peace with one another and with the living world. Powerful teachings to know that we are the people of the seventh fire. We are the ones who are charged with putting the world back together again, picking up those pieces. And so your theme of looking at the casualties is present in that teaching, as is looking at the prospects for the future. In order to think together about what must we pick up, not all of us can pick up everything, right? But what is it for you to pick up? What is it for me to pick up, so that collectively we have what we need to go down that green path? And this is what I'd like to think about together for the rest of our time here. Because what we are called to think about is to walk down that green path. We have to change more than our technologies. That green path is often characterized, this path of sustainability, as we're going to need new policies, we're going to need new tax structures, we're going to need new laws, we're going to need new technology. Yes, we will. We will need all of those things. But unless we also have a change in heart, to change from a worldview of exploitation and objectification of the living world, that green path will come to an end. And so I want to share about this teaching that comes also from another wonderful teacher whose work you probably know, Oren Lyons, a faith keeper at Onondaga Nation, my friend and my neighbor, who after a lifetime, Oren's 90 this year, a lifetime of doing environmental work, he says it all boils down to 4 words: values change for survival. It all boils down to changing the worldview. And let's just have a few words to say about what does that mean. And probably one of the easiest ways to think about it is to think about the words that we use as environmental scientists, policy makers, environmental thinkers. Because it has been said, of course, by many great thinkers that it is words that make our future. Words that make our future. So let's be very careful about the words that we pick up from that ancestor path and what we carry into the future, because words hold our worldview. Let's start with one of perhaps the most important of the words, of land. Land, which is at the heart of so many conflicts, right? What does land mean? In the Western worldview, land is known primarily as property, right? That is the first meaning of land. Sometimes land as capital, certainly land as natural resources, and land as a source of ecosystem services. Is this the land of that soft green path? What if we take seriously, put on those 2-eyed seeing glasses? How else might we see land? Land as a source of our identity, that people's identity is inseparable from the land. Land certainly as our sustainer. Land as the place not only where we live, but where our more than human relatives live. Land as connection to the past and to the future through our ancestors, our descendants. Land as our library. Land as our pharmacy. Land as inspirited, land as our home, land not as a place for which we claim rights, property rights, but land as the place where we enact our moral responsibility because the land is sacred. Let's think about how we use that word land and what do we really mean? Can we, in imagining environmental futures, think more broadly to encompass this meaning of land beyond property? Because is land our source of belongings only, or is it our most profound source of belonging? Other words that we might interrogate as we imagine environmental futures. that word natural resources. I mean, really, when you think about it, what does that mean, right? It means that that the values of the earth are utilitarian, that the earth is there to be exploited, that soil, water, minerals, air, all of these are valuable only when transformed for human use. What if instead we spoke of earthly gifts? What if we viewed the world as a gift? Would that not transform our movement toward that green path? Words matter. Whether we see the world as gift or whether we see the world as natural resources corresponds to where we think we are in the web of life. Are we, as on the left top of some imagined, truly fictional hierarchy of life with white men at the top of the pinnacle of deserving of the riches of the world? Or are we one member of the democracy of species? Are we a great we, or are we an I? Human exceptionalism versus human communities. Another word that we might want to toss out there to be thinking about and how this matters in terms of what path we choose is this word that I know brings all of us together, this longed for sustainability. What does that mean? There's so many definitions, but you know, here we go right to here. You know all these definitions. They're the ones that are taught in all of your classes, all of your textbooks, every policy, right? And a colleague of mine, Carol Crow, talks about bringing these definitions of sustainability to her Cree elders. And they said when they saw all of these, ensure the attainment and continued satisfaction of human needs. When her elders saw this meaning of sustainability through that Western lens of two-eyed seeing, they said, we want you to go to that conference and we want you to carry a message about this so-called sustainability. That sounds to me like they're just trying to find a way to keep on taking. Wow, what a worldview shift on one word of sustainability. It's not our right to keep taking. When your feet hit the ground in the morning, we should be thinking, what can we give? This notion of are we takers or are we givers asks us as educators and as students to say, are we educating to be consumers or citizens? Are we educating to perpetuate an extractive colonial economy or to give birth to a regenerative economy? The words carry weight. The last word that I want to spend a little time with before going into our conversation is to think about the way that colonization is responsible for changing the meaning of those few words that I've introduced this afternoon, this evening. Linguistic imperialism, as you know, is the renaming and the relanguaging as an act of colonization. It's a violent erasure of one way of knowing with another. And we see it in place names, we see it in language loss, we see it in worldview change. And perhaps the most important place that we see it is in this little word right here. Think about it. In English, as speakers of English as your first language, the only way that we have to speak of the living world is as it. We'd say of that makwa there, that bear, we'd say, it's looking at us. That bird, it's sitting in the tree, right? We it nature in English in a way that we would never do for one another. I would never say of Clint, it is an excellent, outstanding ethnobotanist. You know, I would never call you it, Clint, right? It dehumanizes you. It disrespects you. It makes you an object. And that's exactly what English does to the natural world. That butterfly, that waterfall, those strawberries can only be referred to as objects. Is it any wonder that we are enmeshed in an extractive economy? Because with this linguistic imperialism, we have set aside. The consequences of objectification are moral exclusion. We have set the strawberries and the salamanders and the bear and the water outside of our circle of ethical concern. Hence, there we are at that fork in the road of climate chaos, of the age of the sixth extinction. In the Potawatomi language, of which I am a student, and in many other languages, Indigenous languages, it is impossible to say it about butterflies or birds or our more than human relatives. We speak of them with the same grammar that we do our own family, because they are our own family. This is a linguistic flowering of this notion of everybody in the circle, not human beings at the top of a hierarchy, but a community of life by speaking with what is known as the grammar of animacy. And so the last thing that I want to say about the ways in which one of the things that we can pick up to carry ourselves and propel ourselves down that green path is to pick up a grammar of animacy inspired by Indigenous languages. As a scientist, it troubles me greatly when I have to write technical papers that call my great plant teachers it's wrong. It's not truthful, even though it's objective, because they're not objects, they're subjects. And so again, there's my timer telling me stop. I will in just a minute. I began thinking of, could we think about a way to add animacy to the English language? And I spent lots of time listening to the land, trying to think about and to hear how do they speak of one another? What, certainly not as it, but as relatives. What does that sound like? I worked with my language teacher, Stuart King Bunn, and I asked him, in Anishinaabemowin, do we have a word for just a being of the earth, not a thing, but a someone? And he said, yes, we do. And so I thought, could we come up with what I think of as these pronouns to reclaim animacy in the world? And the word for a living being is Bamadasi Aki, an earthly being. And that isn't going to slide easily into English. But the last part of that word is Aki, which is our word for the earth. And the last part of that is Ki. Could we but animate the English language with this new pronoun so that when we speak of a living world, we could say, Ki is picking berries, just like I am. To use this pronoun to speak respectfully of our relatives as living earthly beings, not as things, not as objects, not as commodities. And we'll need a plural as well. And we already have that in English. We'll just add an N, which is incidentally is a way you pluralize some things in Potawatomi, and speak of our relatives collectively as our kin, as our kinfolk. So when those geese, we see them as I did just this morning, we say, kin are flying south for the winter. Have a good trip. We will miss you and come back soon. The prospects that we have for our environmental futures are to use our imaginations to create and bring into being new ways of thinking, which are inspired by the teachings of the original instructions of the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And this grammatical change is perhaps just one example of how we might use our gift for language and imagination to heal our relationships with the living world. So I'm going to stop there because I so want to engage in conversation, play with some of these ideas with you all. And again, to think about these ideas as ways of reanimating our relationship with living world so that we can go down that green path together. Mi'u miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was so rich, and I have so much to engage you with, and I fear that we probably don't have enough time to cover it all. So I'll go ahead and launch into it, and we'll see where it takes us. But I wanted to go ahead and follow through on what you left off on, and it's something that certainly informs my work on a regular basis, whether that's with my students, my Cherokee students, as a part of the program that we collectively work on with the Cherokee Medicine Keepers, a group of elders back home who are guiding our land education program. But that is language, and it all in what the way that our elders had discussed and designed what we come to know now as a kind of shorthand for, and it's an imperfect way of describing it, but curriculum, right? So using a Western term for an Indigenous way of designing an education program, but it always came back to language. And that has always been a guiding principle, is how are we going to discuss and describe what we're doing in the language. And it's difficult. Because, as you said, we have a lot to pick up that was lost along the way, but and it's difficult too because we're confronted with a world in which our languages are certainly not as vibrant as they once were. In fact, I would say, and I think linguists have declared that all Indigenous languages in North America are endangered. We know this, but we work incrementally to pick them back up, as you said so beautifully. And so in what ways can we, as you do in your book with your chapter on the grammar of animacy, in what ways can we understand that the way we talk about things in our languages is fundamentally different, and that encodes in itself a lesson in environmental knowledge. And so to kind of pick up where you were going toward the end of your talk, thinking about just very simply, simply but profoundly, the names that we have for plants and for animals and what they tell us. And so thinking about many Indigenous languages as being classified as polysynthetic. That's a linguistic term for basically saying that you can't really break them apart in ways that English words or sentences can be broken apart in. And how they describe a world in motion, how they're verb-based primarily. And so this animacy that you speak of, we hear it across the board when we talk to speakers, no matter what Indigenous language we're learning about or we're talking about. But what's so beautiful about it is, as you were gesturing toward, is that the lessons within that, and I'll just give a very quick example in Cherokee, and you've given plenty in your talk and then in the book as well. But the lessons that we have from these names not only teach us our relationality to that being, but usually say something more about how they interact with other beings that are more than human, as you say. And so something as simple as what we call wild rose, gistu uni gist, so the rabbit eats it, is in fact profound. To me it is, because it tells you a little bit about what animal relies on that plant. And vice versa, what, as you so eloquently describe in your book, what that plant has to give another being, right? And so I wondered if we could spend some time talking about language, its centrality in conveying an alternative worldview that is so desperately needed today, and as a really grounded way of answering the question, how do we do this? This worldview shift. And so your example, I think, is really inspiring in that it offers a way, drawing from Anishinaabe that is very grounded, it's very practical, and yet has a very fundamental shift to it. And so in what other ways, in kind of thinking about plants specifically, have you been able to kind of think about this in relation to whether it's the names that you're learning through, as I am, or students of our languages, and how else does that get you to think outside this Western box?
Wonderful question, Clint. Um, I think that it has everything to do with the relationships that are coded in names and the stories that are present in names. And when I teach botany, especially when I teach ethnobotany, one of the things that I have noticed, and maybe you have too with your students, is very often our Western science students, the first thing they want to know is the name of a plant. And what I noticed in teaching is that if I told them the name right away, this is white pine, this is Pinus strobus, I could almost see the blinds go down on their eyes. Like, okay, that's all I need to know. I've filled in the box about the name of this plant, and that is not an invitation to relationship. It objectifies those beings again. And so what I've been doing in my teaching is not to tell them the names of the plants. I invite them to name plants not the way Linnaeus did, by objectifying them and stamping his name on them, but the way one of our trickster teachers, Nana Bojo, named plants, which was by listening to them and observing them so carefully that those plants told him what their names were. They revealed their names to him. And that distinction may seem like quaint folklore, but it is not. It's a whole worldview of accepting the personhood of those plants, the intelligence of those plants, and the humility to learn from plants. It's a whole worldview held in a name. And so I encourage my students to first, get to know those beings, and then if you want a Latin epithet, you bet, there you go. But only after you've come into relationship with that being. I also like for them to know the Anishinaabe words because, as you suggest, they're so rich. One example, a tree I love so much, the eastern white pine. Um, and when I was learning its name in our language is Jingguak. And there are a number of other conifers who have that jing in their name. And what does that mean? And it turns out it means to lay down. And I thought, white pines, spruces, balsam fir, they're not prostrate in any way. And so as I was thinking, why are they called that? I was suddenly swept back to lying on a bed of pine and balsam boughs, um, sleeping out with my dad when he would cut those boughs, and we would sleep in those heavenly springy beds. Why are they called lying down? Because that's their gift to us, that we can lie down on them. So much of a worldview held in that word that speaks of their personhood, of their generosity, and the way that they give their gift to people. A small example, I think about the way that we can decolonize the way that we think about our relatives, to think of them as gift givers, and we humble recipients of those gifts, not the exploiters of natural resources.
Absolutely. And, it's pretty, I would say, prevalent in what I've come across from talking to others about medicine traditions, certainly in Cherokee ways of understanding health and healing. Plants are helpers. They and they can only help with that spirit and that emotion, that connection is honored. And so going back to your point of recognizing the personhood of plants, and also how that fundamentally contradicts the term natural resources, as something that you take or something that you manage or control, which of course echoes back to the critique that you made against a command and control approach to how we're going to view the world in this critical moment that we inhabit. Kind of stemming from that, also and picking up where you left off too, I think it's really, I've been thinking a lot about, at least since I started my work years ago, back in 2004, with working with knowledge keepers, developing relationships with elders back home. I've witnessed from folks who I continue to work with, and we continue to collaborate. I mentioned the Cherokee Nation medicine keepers, and it just seems to be a revolution of attitude towards sharing. And certainly there are aspects to our our knowledge systems that still demand respect and demand a certain amount of caution to be shared. But what the message that I hear you saying, and the message that I hear a lot of my elders talking about too, is that we've reached a point in which it's time to share some fundamental things that our knowledge systems have to offer. And that to me is profound, because when I hear that, I think, for so long, as you said, there's been things that have been taken along that path. If you envision that path you were describing, we have to go and pick them up, but we also have to be thinking about what they contribute to the world, and how the message that they carry is urgent today. And so, I'm thinking about this fundamental idea of how that requires a deep sense of forgiveness, but also openness and confidence and validation of Indigenous knowledge. And I wonder if you've thought about that as well, in terms of, um, not only the significance of it, but the mechanisms by which we can do this. And I come back to often, the courses that I teach, the students that we can reach in these settings, whether it be, unfortunately, remotely, as we're doing now, or in the classroom, or out on the land. But thinking about some of these broader ways of getting that message out. Have you spent have you really contemplated certain avenues that, certainly Oren Lyons has done a lot in his lifetime to get this message out. And yet it seems like we still have so much to share. So I just wanted to leave you with that, and think, hear your thoughts on.
Yes. Yeah. Clint, I so much agree with you, the way that the ground is shifting toward sharing of knowledge. But that knowledge sharing is coupled to responsibility for that knowledge. And that you and I and so many other Indigenous scholars and knowledge holders are respectfully sharing that which can be medicine for our relationship with the world and with each other. I think there's lots of boundaries on sharing specific cultural knowledge that is to be protected, but the worldview, the healing nature of relationship with the living world. I can think of so many elders, as I'm sure you can too, who have said that against all odds, our knowledge was protected, and it was protected because there would come a time when the whole world needed this knowledge. And by the whole world, I don't just mean the human world. I mean that big, expansive web of land. And that in return for the gift of life that we have been given, in return for the gift of that knowledge, it's our responsibility to use it on behalf of our relatives, and to use it well. And so that power of sharing, to share it because it is medicine, it feels to me that like it would be unethical not to share it, because it is so much needed to share it carefully, and to always share it coupled to responsibility. And I think I also hear in your question of how do we do that, I sure hear it in Oren, is it, how are we going to get this message to 9 billion people? And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to the environmental futures class, because there were scientists and artists and poets and dancers and gardeners, and it's all of those ways. We have to break down the walls and use all of those gifts around the medicine wheel to share this message, because each of us hears it differently. Each of us has a different piece to pick up along that ancestor path. And for myself, it really, I am such a believer in story, that stories are carriers of the medicine. And when for me it came a choice of I could keep writing peer-reviewed technical articles that would incrementally add to our knowledge of the plant world. I love doing plant ecology research, but in reciprocity for the gifts of the plants, my work is to tell stories that will carry that message more broadly into the world. These are urgent times we live in, and I think it calls for each of us to give whatever gift we have on behalf of our relatives and of each other.
Yeah, and I really like the way you invoke responsibility here, because you know, we've um, in my class we've been reading Daniel Wildcat, and of course Dan Wildcat's drawing a lot on Vine Deloria Jr. about, you know, how that alters or fundamentally shifts the conversation from that of rights to one of responsibilities. And also, as you're implying too, as I'm hearing you say, it demands a relationship. That responsibility of, okay, we are sharing this. And so we can talk about reciprocity. We can talk about what it means to accept a gift, what it means to reciprocate in that relationship that is so much needed in these times. You know, how we relate to one another, and of course, how we relate to the earth and the other than human, the more than human beings who we share this planet with. And also to pick up on your note about stories, and then we'll get to some questions and engagement from the audience here. I wanted just to say too that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about story in this time, and it's profound in that it really anchors some of these things that we talk about, these worldviews or perspectives, and furthermore, it kind of, well, it really gets people out of the romanticism that tends to come in association with Native peoples and the environment. You know, we've dealt with the stereotypes, usually you know, discussed in terms of the ecologically noble Indian, right?
Right.
But stories really anchor and de-romanticize, in my opinion. And in many cases, our stories are teaching us about past mistakes that the people have made too, right? And so it upsets this idea that Native people have always been and are always, quote, in tune with nature, and it humanizes it in a way that says, you know, we've learned these stories out of experience, and this is why we carry them with us today, and this is what they have to teach, and this is what we're taking seriously about this history and about the mistakes that our people have made in the past, and more importantly, the lessons that we learned from it and the ongoing obligations.
It also puts it in an evolutionary context, because what it then tells us is that stories about earth care, let's say, stories about reciprocity have adaptive value. That's why our people have persisted against all odds, is because we did learn from mistakes, we learned from the living world. And if you didn't learn, your evolutionary fitness was curtailed, shall we say. So
Absolutely.
the lesson, yeah.
Right. Well, I have a question here, and then I will, after this one, Erin and I are going to kind of hand off and do this as a team as far as the Q&A. But I have a question, and this is from a student in my department of ethnic studies, and my colleague, who also happens to be my wife, is teaching a course, a graduate level course called Indigenous Thought and Theory. And so this is a PhD student from that course. They are reading your book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And so Jacqueline Monzo writes, thank you so much, Robin Kimmerer, for joining us today. Your book was healing, and what I needed to read during these times. Many people have been feeling really disconnected lately, especially because everything has been online. It feels like it's harder to find oneself outside with nature. Excuse me. What are some ways and things you are currently doing to feel connected to all things around you? Do you have any advice for students who are feeling isolated now more than ever? I appreciate your work and teachings. Thank you.
Mm. Well, I so appreciate those sentiments that I know we're all feeling. And I think one of the outcomes is that it makes us treasure relationship and connection in a really powerful way. I think that the constraints we're under also creates for us, I think we can all relate to this notion of vulnerability. We all feel very vulnerable, right? In those moments when we're asking, not only about the health of ourselves and our loved ones and our communities, where will I get my food? How will I take care of myself? Where will I live? All of those things. We are suddenly feeling the vulnerability of being animals. Um, and that is powerful and humbling. And I find that to be a source of connection, because then when you look at the rest of the world, our vulnerability that we're coming to recognize can be a source of ecological compassion for the other beings around us. Who think about songbirds every day of their lives. They're asking the same questions. What will I get to eat? Where will I live? Can I go there because it's dangerous? And I think that it can create a profound sense of shared connection through vulnerability. And what has kept me connected to the living world is to go outside, every day as often as I can, put down my zooming, and go outside and connect to that which is most profound and real and healing. To have my feet on the ground, to put down my tobacco and be grateful for everything that I have, which is an antidote for that feeling of regret for what we don't have. Gratitude is such a powerful teaching of abundance, and that to me has been a saving practice in this time. To treasure what I have, not what I don't.
Right, and I think I think this is from a presentation you gave a couple of weeks ago out of University of New Mexico on multi-species justice, but you had said, gratitude that fundamentally alters the neurons in our minds, just kind of having that position of being thankful on a daily basis. And so absolutely, I think that's a profound way of kind of coming into this moment and, working, struggling through this moment for sure.
We've had dozens of questions pouring in, Robin. So everyone is profoundly moved by your way of storytelling and the stories you're sharing with us, and I think also the kindness and thoughtfulness that you're bringing to a greater attention of the natural world. One of the things that seems to be echoing through a lot of these questions, though, it seems to me a bit of fearfulness about how to embrace some of the things that you're offering us. So for instance, I'm getting a couple of questions from people who are saying, as a white woman, I want to avoid co-opting Native views, as a white person in academia, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, it sounds like our audience is both inspired, but also at some level has trepidation about employing some of these ideas without cultural appropriation being, kind of an accusation.
Mm-hmm. Very appropriately, and I respect the intent behind those questions. The fact that you're asking them is really important, right? Because it implies that recognition that we know what cultural appropriation is. It's taking without permission, right? It's taking that which does not belong to you. Does gratitude for a drink of water belong to anyone? Does gratitude for eating strawberries belong to anyone? I don't think so. For me, the path ahead is authentic engagement of your relationship to place and to the beings around us. Cultural appropriation, taking that which doesn't belong to you, is taking someone else's way of being grateful. But your way of being grateful, your way of showing respect is authentic and heartfelt, and you need to work your way through to figure out, how do I express that in the most authentic way possible. And I guess that's the best answer that I can give, is that we often feel as if, well, we want to take from Indigenous ways of knowing because we don't have our own. Well, make your own. Make your own, because it comes from relationship, as Clint has been pointing out so well. It comes from relationship, and grow that relationship into something sacred.
And I think what you've been suggesting too, the idea of language being shared, that we can share language, that we can take the scientific language, use that as we'd like, take the kin, take the key, and use that and share that. I mean, that's the other thing that seems to me essential in moving ahead through all of this is the generosity of storytelling, and therefore language sharing for the most part, although of course there's visual storytelling too, but sharing that, and not necessarily being afraid of having these shared stories.
Yeah. I think, especially because this is an academic audience, I think one more thing that I would add about that is that when you do feel, as you said appropriately, afraid about doing this, think about the ways within the academy that we have of honoring other people's contributions. We cite them, right? We cite them. We do the same thing in Indigenous knowledge sharing. You always say where you got that story from, who taught you that. And yeah, we know how to do that.
Absolutely, yes. Clint, shall I send it back to you?
Sure. Yeah, I have a question here from Prakriti Mukherjee, who writes, how does one balance activism and gratitude for what we have? So this, I guess, dialectic between, in this moment especially, activist work. And then further, they seem to occupy very different ways of being, but equally important for social justice. And I picked up on your slides when you were talking about, decolonizing education, and that can occupy many different spaces. But when we think about what I think the essence of the question is regarding those type of activist spaces that we typically, I guess, would assume, and the realm in which they occur versus the type of other elements to your work that you're trying to get across on more of a collective sense of changing worldviews, and kind of the inward looking spiritual and emotional work.
I think they're in dialogue with one another. If I respond to the very beginning part of that question of how does one both practice deep gratitude and take an activist stance, practicing deep gratitude, real gratitude, the kind of gratitude that brings you into relationship with the living world, that doesn't let the living world be objectified, that's radical gratitude. And I think it's an activist stance to cultivate gratitude, and to cultivate contentment when we live in extractive economies that are constantly telling us we need to buy more, we need to buy more. Gratitude and contentment that leads to sort of restraints on consumption is a powerful stance. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. Gratitude does not mean complacency. Gratitude doesn't mean sitting back and saying, hey, everything's great, I've got everything that I need. No, gratitude comes with responsibility. The power of gratitude, well, as we know, when someone gives us a gift, we say thank you. And what do we want to do next? We want to give our gift. So gratitude is that doorway to reciprocity that's saying, okay, I have been the recipient of these gifts. Now what's my gift? And my gift might be raising a garden, raising kids, raising a ruckus when you need to. And so I think they can go hand in hand. They feed each other.
On that note of motherhood, which is, I'm always impressed in your bio that is one of the first ways you identify yourself, Robin. All three of us here on this conversation have daughters. And one question that's come up from the audience is the chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass, where you write about your daughter's knowledge and research, and you format it as an academic article. Even though that knowledge clearly exceeds that structure. So there's some question embedded in this question is thinking about how you are, again, operating within an academic institution and bringing in these alternate forms of knowledge, which you've so eloquently given strength to tonight. I don't know if the question is clear, but if maybe if there's an elaboration there on how you've played that role.
Yeah. I think it has to do with a kind of claiming wholeness that oftentimes our professions, and certainly I can only speak really to academia, demands a kind of compartmentalization in ourselves. And I wanted to be very careful, or to grow into a place where I could be careful to be whole and to not let that happen. And that's why I always put mother first, because that, titles and degrees and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's great, but that's not what matters most. And so that is a stance of saying, no, that's what I really care about, and that's who I am. And in the work that I've done, I've tried to set very clear intentions, because clearly this kind of writing, this kind of work is not, as I think all of us will attest, is not always well rewarded in siloed academia, right? And folks can say, well, you're not doing what you ought to do because you're not doing everything that we're doing. So what I've tried to do is set out from the very beginning, these are my metrics of success. And I lay these out for myself, and this is how I have achieved those metrics. They might not be your metrics, but they're very intentional. And that's the way it is. And fortunately, I'm in a place where that strategy has worked, which is not to say that it does everywhere. Oh my goodness, it sure doesn't. But if you do it with strength and intention and clarity to say, this too is a very viable way of being an academic. You also teach your colleagues that how do they want to define academic success?
And you open a pathway for future generations of parents and people coming forward and being able to not be defined by something that they believe they have to define themselves as.
Right. Yeah, that's such a good point, that you end up liberating other people by stating your truth. This is how I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Robin, I have another question here, and I'm choosing it because I think you so wonderfully address this in the book. It's from Eileen, who writes, can you speak to the idea of environmental melancholia, the pathology of being melancholic about the collapse of the environment, and how to move forward with compassion without feeling paralyzed?
Yeah. The price of attentiveness to the living world is that you're attentive to the beauty as well as to the wounds, right? You really feel them. And when you embrace the world as relative and family, it bears a toll in pain and grief for our relatives. The way that I try to both feel that and be with that is first of all to be with it. Say, of course, Of course you grieve these losses. Of course you're anxious for them. But that grief is the measure of our love for them. And that grief is powerful, but if it leads to despair, then we can't help our relatives. We can't help those beings that we love. And so for me, it is that work of transforming melancholia to action. To say on behalf of what I love, I will act. I will roll up my sleeves and do what needs to be done. But that's not to sweep under the rug the way that we feel about it. And it's important that we do feel it, because otherwise that green path that we're on is not a path of personhood and ecological compassion. It's just it's more superficial in a way. It's not a really deep change of into relationship. So that's kind of a rambling sort of answer, but to me, it's the transformation of grief into love, into action. When I think about the times that we are in, which many have called, this great narrowing that we are going through, that if we think about what we want the world to be like on the other side of this narrows, the only things that will come through this time of constriction is what we carry there. It's not unlike the seventh fire. It's like, what are you going to pick up? What are you personally going to pick up and carry through these times of limitation so that your children can have them on the other side? Is that a source of pain and melancholia? Yes, but I find it also a source of joy to say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. I'm going to carry those seeds.
I want to make everyone aware that we are working in partnership with the Boulder Bookstore, and proceeds from buying Dr. Kimmerer's book right now will go towards the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, and help them, as well as you would have a wonderful, wonderful copy of the new Milkweed edition. I think we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll ask one last question, and then Clint, I'll leave it to you for a final question of your own or from the audience in closing. So the question I have is from Natasha Steinman, who's mentioning that several of the people on this call are working as part of land management agencies and working as part of the government system. And she asks, what advice would you give to those of us who have to answer to objectifying laws, charters, and bureaucracy? How would you suggest we might work to introduce subjectivity?
I think I would, two things I guess I would want to say, because the questioner particularly brought forward subjectivity. Much of what we've been talking about tonight, this animacy of the living world, the personhood of the living world, if we take that seriously, to say that we're talking about persons here, not managing natural resources, but creating justice for more than human persons, I think that opens up to us a whole new set of tools that I'm excited in a future for agencies and others to embrace. And these are the tools that are associated with the rights of nature and the personhood of all beings. And I think that is a very real and realistic goal to move toward, that we move toward policies and actions which are based on rights of nature, which flow out of subjectivity. So it's a very practical way. Does it take a long time to get there? It sure does. But gosh, the Indigenous nations in this country are just really blazing the trail for that. You think about the Yurok Nation, protecting the inherent rights of the Klamath North River, for example. There are ways through this that are revolutionary, and I'm encouraged by those. The last thing I would say has to do not with that longer term vision, but how do you just navigate that reality when your heart says subjectivity and your job description says objectivity. What I tell my students is and not just my native students, but my many students who have tremendous skepticism and resistance to the scientific worldview, but want to use the tools of science. And that's what I try to tell them, is to separate those two things. You can use the tools of Western science without embracing the scientific worldview. Separate those, use some of the powerful tools of Western science within an Indigenous knowledge framework. That's really, I think, where we need to go.
Thank you.
Well, I guess this is our last question, or that all that we have time for, but I wanted to kind of bring in a question that I'm seeing here in the Q&A, and then also kind of relate it to what you've written about previously, and get your thoughts on how you see this as a possibility looking forward. The question is from Ashley Richards, and they write, do you have any advice for folks working in agriculture in big cities who have to constantly justify and discuss the benefits of community gardens, biodiversity, and food production? There is ongoing displacement and gentrification of Black and brown growers who are stewarding the land, many of whom are losing the land they are growing on to developers and city agencies. We have to constantly monetize the benefits to compete, which is misguided, oppressive, and exhausting. And so it makes me think about when you write about, we need each other. And so how would you articulate solidarity across these different kind of lines, urban, rural, Native, and other marginalized communities, whether that be along the lines of class, race, ethnicity? How do we enact that? And then specifically addressing Ashley's question with regard to urban agriculture.
Yeah. I think that we have to keep, first and foremost, the notion that social justice and environmental justice are the same thing. That these are not separate pursuits, right? All of us have our feet on the ground. All of us are breathing the same air, and the issues of justice for more than human people and the issues of justice for human people are inextricably linked. And the marginalization of Black and brown people is mirrored in the marginalization of non-human people as well. It's the same fight. In the world of urban settings and the loss of land, it's always land. It's always land. It's the same story. Yeah. Clint, as you and I both have people who've been removed from their homelands, I hear that in the questioner's question. People are being removed from land that they are working to become bonded to and native to. And there again, I think it is this work of changing our ideas that land isn't property, capital, natural resources. Land is a web of relationships. And we can say, well, yes, the folks who are in charge don't see it that way. Well, that's where our work comes in, isn't it? To change the worldview, to change that story, to resist that narrative of what land means. I don't know exactly how to do that, except for to say that each of us in our own context, that is the work, is to change the narrative. It isn't just restoration, in Gary Nabhan's wonderful phrase, it's restoration. We have to tell ourselves a different story and live a different story.
Yes, and the power of that when it becomes a collective goal, and the power of that when it becomes something that isn't some idea of a fringe perspective, but that actually occupies the center of our conversations around land and livelihoods and relationship.
Yes. And Clint, you were suggesting, as well as the questioner, how this has to be collective, right? That's how things change. And one of the powerful things that I have learned from Braiding Sweetgrass's work in the world is, when I think of all the things that I hear from readers, probably one of the most common and heartening is for someone to say, "I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one who felt that way about land or about birds or about water." And I have found out that that is not true. And once you know that you're not alone, once you start to have a shared vocabulary and a shared story for the future that we want to live in, that is really powerful. I always lament that I cannot single-handedly topple Monsanto, but I'm in charge of what I think, and I'm in charge of how I act. And we each have that power. We each have that power. And that's when the story changes.
Thank you for that. And Erin, would you like to say a few words in closing? I know we only have a couple minutes left.
Thank you so much, Robin. It has been a treasure to have you here virtually, and our students are so grateful, and we are so happy to have heard a little bit more from you, and of course read your stories, and we will continue to do so, and I hope there will be many more that we can read and hear as time comes on upon us in circular and multiplicity of fashions of moving, not just in a linear way. So thank you.
Yeah, big witch. Thank you.
And I'll just echo all the thanks that I'm seeing on the chat as well, and then say in my language, Gayali Haley Jeha, I am grateful to you. It's so good to see you, and just wish you well. Take care.
And you as well, my friend. Good night, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.